What if the most powerful weapon in royal circles was never money, but silence? Not contracts, not signatures, not even threats, just an understanding. An unspoken rule that once something happens behind gilded doors, it stays there. Forever. And for years, that rule held. Until now. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because according to whispers that refuse to die, Sarah Ferguson, a woman who has survived royal exile, humiliation, and being quietly erased, has allegedly reached a moment where silence no longer protects anyone, including herself. And that's where this story begins. Not with a yacht, not with a prince, not even with Meghan, but with a decision. A decision to stop carrying a secret that was never supposed to surface. Ask yourself this. Why would someone who knows how dangerous speaking out can be suddenly decide, I will speak now? What changes? What breaks? And more importantly, who panics when that silence cracks? This story matters now because timing is never accidental. When silence collapses, it's usually because someone believes the truth is safer than the secret. But what truth? And whose version of it? For years, there have been rumors, always dismissed, always waved away, about a supposed 2010 encounter involving powerful names, luxury settings, and a quiet agreement that no one would ever speak of what happened. No interviews, no confirmations, no denials that lasted very long, just avoidance. But here's the contradiction that should make you pause. If nothing happened, why the need for silence? If there was no agreement, why does everyone behave as if there was? And if the story was meaningless, why has it followed these figures for more than a decade? This introduction is not about proving anything. It's about understanding why certain stories refuse to stay buried. Because the royal world does not operate like the rest of society. It runs on proximity to power, on favors, on social debts, and above all, on reputation management. In that world, silence isn't passive. It's active. It's negotiated. It's enforced not by law, but by access. Lose access, and you lose everything. Sarah Ferguson knows that better than most. Once married into the monarchy, once adored, once discarded. She learned early that loyalty is rewarded only as long as it's convenient. After that, you become invisible. And invisibility teaches people things. It teaches them who really controls the narrative. It teaches them who is protected. And it teaches them who is expendable. So when sources whisper that Sarah allegedly knows about a silence pact, not written, not signed, but understood, people lean in. Because she has nothing left to gain by lying, but potentially everything to lose by telling the truth. Now let's talk about why this story refuses to stay quiet. Every few years, the same elements resurface. A luxury yacht. A year everyone avoids discussing. A circle of people who never quite deny knowing each other, but never explain how they met either. And in the middle of that fog stands Meghan, long before the palace, long before global fame, long before carefully crafted narratives. This is where viewers often split into camps. Some say the rumors are cruel, sexist, and unfounded. Others say powerful people don't get surrounded by rumors for no reason. Both sides ask the same question, whether they admit it or not. Why does this keep coming back? Here's the uncomfortable answer. Because silence without closure creates imagination. And imagination is dangerous. In elite circles, rumors are controlled by access. But once access is gone, stories take on lives of their own. They mutate. They spread. They become larger than the truth itself. And that's where alleged agreements come in. Not to hide crimes, but to prevent embarrassment. Not to erase history, but to freeze it. The alleged yacht silence pact, as whispered in commentary circles, wasn't about one person protecting another. It was about mutual survival. Everyone keeps quiet. Everyone walks away intact. Everyone moves on. But here's the flaw in that logic. People change. Circumstances shift. And silence only works when all parties believe it still benefits them. So what happens when someone decides it doesn't? That's the question hanging over this entire story. Why now? Why after years of restraint? Why after public narratives have hardened into accepted truth? Some suggest the answer lies in regret. Others suggest fear. And some believe it's because someone else broke the rules first. Because silence pacts, alleged or not, depend on trust. And trust erodes quietly. One missed call, one denied favor, one public distancing. Suddenly, the unspoken agreement starts to feel one-sided. And that's when people start remembering details they once forgot. This introduction isn't here to accuse. It's here to frame the emotional mechanics of silence. Because what's most fascinating isn't the rumor itself. It's how many people appear invested in keeping it buried. Notice the deflections, the sudden changes of subject, the selective outrage. Why attack the rumor instead of dismissing it? Why ridicule instead of clarify? In storytelling, that behavior always signals tension. And tension means unresolved conflict. As we move forward, this story will not rush to conclusions. It will rewind. It will examine power, image, ambition, and survival. It will ask why certain figures are shielded and why others are scrutinized. And it will explore how Sarah Ferguson, a woman once laughed out of the palace, may hold a key not because she was powerful, but because she was present. But before we get there, one final question needs to sit with you. If silence was the price of protection, who stopped paying? Because whatever happened next didn't just threaten reputations. It threatened the entire structure that kept everyone safe. And once that structure cracks, nothing stays hidden for long. But what pushed Sarah Ferguson to the edge? What moment made her allegedly decide that speaking was less dangerous than staying quiet? That answer lies at the very beginning. What breaks a person who has survived public humiliation, royal exile, and years of whispered judgment? Not anger, not fear, not boredom. Sometimes it's clarity. Sarah Ferguson, once a princess, once a figure in the global spotlight, is alleged to have reached such a moment. The moment when silence, which had long protected her, suddenly became a liability. The moment when carrying a secret was heavier than the consequences of telling it. But what was this secret? And why did it matter so much that, after years of discretion, Ferguson allegedly decided to speak now? The story begins in the delicate corridors of elite society, where power is invisible but omnipresent. It's a world where every gesture, every whispered conversation, and every glance can carry weight. Here, silence is currency, and the wrong word at the wrong time can erase a life. For Sarah Ferguson, this world was never kind. She married into it young, navigated its treacherous waters, and discovered that reputation could be both a shield and a trap. She learned early that privilege came with rules that were invisible to outsiders and merciless to insiders. And she learned that being silent sometimes wasn't a choice, it was survival. Yet, in the alleged case of the so-called Yacht Silence Pact, involving Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew, Ferguson's decision to speak did not come lightly. According to sources close to royal commentary circles, it was a slow build, a crescendo of pressure that finally reached its peak. Imagine a scale. On one side, loyalty, discretion, and the perceived safety of silence. On the other side, truth, clarity, and the potential to set the record straight. For decades, Ferguson balanced on that fulcrum. But something shifted. Rumors, as they often do, began to spiral. Snippets of alleged interactions resurfaced on social media, speculative commentaries started circulating, and what had been discreet whispers transformed into headline possibilities. The world had changed, and so had Ferguson's calculus. There are moments in history where the timing of revelation is everything. Why speak today instead of 10 years ago? Because events, public attention, and personal reflection align in a rare, dangerous confluence. Ferguson allegedly recognized that remaining silent now could be interpreted as complicity, or worse, as cowardice. The build-up to this decision is worth exploring. Consider her position, a former royal with years of experience in navigating media scrutiny, understanding public perception, and managing crises. Ferguson is no stranger to scandal. She knows the machinery of exposure, the subtle ways stories are framed, and the swift judgments society renders. Yet even with this knowledge, the alleged pressure of the 2010 yacht encounter reached a point where remaining silent was no longer a neutral act. According to sources familiar with royal insider commentary, Ferguson reportedly weighed the risks meticulously. Speaking meant reigniting old tensions, possibly angering powerful figures, and inviting scrutiny into personal relationships she had worked decades to stabilize. Yet silence, in a world increasingly obsessed with transparency, now carried its own peril. Why now specifically? Observers speculate it is due to a confluence of factors. 1. The alleged breakdown of trust among those who had long enforced the silence. 2. The growing public curiosity about Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew's intersecting paths before her royal fame. And 3. Ferguson's own evolving perspective on accountability and legacy. It's alleged that Ferguson's decision was not impulsive but strategic. She reportedly identified a moment when speaking could maximize impact while minimizing immediate personal risk. This speaks to a level of calculation honed over years in a world where missteps are magnified and forgiveness is rare. Yet even with planning, no one can predict human response. Ferguson knew that revealing what she allegedly knew would create ripples. People she considered allies could distance themselves. The public could misinterpret her motives. And the very figures whose past actions she intended to illuminate could retaliate, subtly or overtly. So why risk it? Because according to insiders, some truths simply refuse to remain buried. They manifest in leaks, in social chatter, in the collective imagination. Ferguson allegedly realized that silence, once protective, was now complicit in perpetuating misunderstanding. The scales had tipped. Now consider the psychological aspect. Silence is not passive, it is active engagement with power dynamics. For decades, Ferguson played this game expertly. She maintained relationships, managed her image, and survived scandal. But the alleged weight of this particular secret, a pact involving two high-profile figures with considerable influence, created a unique burden. It was not just about what happened, it was about what could happen if the story stayed buried. Allegedly, Ferguson's decision to speak was also influenced by principle. Sources suggest she felt a moral obligation to clarify certain narratives, to protect people caught in the web of rumor, and to assert her own agency. Speaking was, in a sense, reclaiming control over a story she had watched unfold from the shadows for too long. The emotional buildup cannot be overstated. Imagine carrying knowledge that could rewrite perceptions of well-known figures, understanding that revealing it could alter public opinion, and recognizing that timing would dictate whether it was seen as revelation or betrayal. This is where Ferguson's alleged courage becomes central. Not recklessness, but measured, deliberate, and high-stakes bravery. And yet, even in preparation, uncertainty lingered. How would the media frame her words? How would the palace respond? Would the public believe her? Could the silence pact, allegedly crafted with precision and reinforced through social enforcement, withstand her disclosure? These questions intensified the stakes. Ferguson allegedly recognized that she was stepping into a storm with no guarantee of clarity or fairness. Yet, she proceeded. The alternative, continued silence, was no longer neutral. Her decision also highlights a fascinating paradox. The more powerful a secret, the more fragile it becomes over time. Social dynamics, public curiosity, and evolving personal priorities all contribute to pressure. Allegedly, Ferguson realized that the pact's protective power had diminished, that those who once adhered to it might falter, and that disclosure was no longer solely about exposure. It was about survival, clarity, and reclaiming narrative authority. And so she spoke. Or, in this narrative, she prepared to speak, to break the silence, to navigate the repercussions, to challenge expectations and rewrite perceptions. But even as Ferguson allegedly positioned herself for this revelation, the world was unprepared for the shockwaves. Because speaking about secrets in royal circles is never merely about information. It is about perception, power, and the delicate architecture of influence. And in this case, the architecture was vast, intricate, and precarious. By the time Ferguson made her decision, the pieces were already moving. Observers note subtle signs. Increased media scrutiny on overlapping figures, public speculation fueled by cryptic statements, and a heightened sense of urgency among those aware of the alleged pact. All of these signaled that the story was ready to surface. Yet, one question remained. Was Ferguson merely responding to external pressure, or was this a proactive claim of narrative control? Allegedly, it was both. She saw an opportunity to assert truth as she perceived it, to navigate the chaos before it navigated her, and to ensure that silence no longer dictated the terms of perception. Imagine a world where words are weapons and silence is armor, where what is unsaid carries more weight than what is spoken. Welcome to the hidden universe of royal agreements, whispers, and unspoken rules. A universe that has shaped lives, dictated fates, and allegedly created the environment for the yacht Silence Pact between Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew. The royal family, for centuries, has operated on an implicit understanding. Discretion is everything. A private misstep becomes a public scandal only if it escapes the invisible guardrails. These guardrails are maintained not by contracts, but by shared understanding, loyalty, and, sometimes, fear. They are the invisible threads that keep the machinery running smoothly, and anyone who disrupts them risks exile from favor, influence, and, in extreme cases, the public eye itself. But what is a silence pact in this context? Unlike a legal agreement, it's not signed, notarized, or filed. There are no lawyers, no courtroom consequences. Its power comes entirely from social enforcement, mutual interest, and the intricate, often perilous, web of influence. To break it is not merely a legal transgression. It's a betrayal of trust, a violation of an unspoken covenant that can reshape reputations and relationships in one swift move. Consider the analogy to Hollywood or political elites. High-profile figures often operate under similar unwritten rules. Gossip is controlled. Missteps are contained. Leaks are punished socially, if not legally. But the stakes in a royal context are elevated because history, legacy, and public perception are always involved. One whispered misstatement can ripple across decades, affecting dynasties and public sentiment alike. Allegedly, the yacht incident in 2010 became a perfect storm for such a pact. According to insiders, the encounter involved powerful figures in a private setting, a setting removed from media scrutiny, but still vulnerable to exposure. The alleged agreement that followed was designed not just to protect reputations, but to freeze the incident in time, ensuring it would not become part of the public record. But why would such a pact be necessary at all? In the royal context, appearances are everything. The monarchy operates not only as an institution, but as a symbol, and symbols are fragile. Even unverified stories, if circulated widely, can challenge credibility, undermine public trust, and distort historical narratives. This is why discretion is enforced with such intensity. People are watched. Statements are measured. Silence becomes a tool of governance. Sarah Ferguson, for example, is intimately familiar with the consequences of violating these norms. She experienced firsthand how quickly the machinery of rumor and reputation can crush someone. And this context explains why her alleged decision to speak now is so dramatic. She has lived under the weight of these unspoken rules and knows exactly what she risks. The culture of silence pacts also relies heavily on social leverage. They work best when everyone involved has something to lose. If a person is untouchable, impervious to reputation damage, or indifferent to public opinion, the pact loses its power. Conversely, when participants have mutual vulnerabilities, the agreement becomes almost unbreakable. In essence, it's an elaborate balancing act. Trust is enforced through the threat of exposure, but exposure is only threatening if it carries meaningful consequences. Another crucial element of these pacts is selective memory. Everyone involved is expected to act as though the event never occurred. Meetings, social interactions, and public statements are carefully orchestrated to avoid reference to the incident. Over time, these rituals create a kind of collective amnesia. Outsiders see nothing. Insiders maintain the pretense. But cracks form when someone begins to question the arrangement, when alliances shift, or when someone outside the inner circle discovers details that were never meant to be shared. And that is where tension enters the picture. Sources suggest that in the years following the alleged 2010 yacht incident, subtle signs of friction began to appear. Miscommunications, minor leaks, and public interactions that seemed awkward in retrospect hinted at an underlying fracture. While the pact may have functioned flawlessly at first, human behavior is rarely so obedient over time. Memories fade, priorities shift, trust erodes, and when one person begins to reconsider the benefits of silence, the entire agreement becomes vulnerable. It's also important to consider the psychological dynamics at play. For participants, the pact functions as both shield and constraint. It protects them from scrutiny, but also limits freedom. It dictates behavior, influencing how individuals interact socially and publicly. Some comply willingly, recognizing the mutual benefit. Others may comply reluctantly, calculating risk versus reward. And still others may chafe, resenting the restriction, quietly plotting a way to circumvent it. Here is where the alleged Ferguson intervention becomes pivotal. By allegedly breaking her silence, she disrupts not only the immediate agreement, but also the broader culture that supports it. It's akin to removing a keystone from an arch. The structure may still stand temporarily, but instability is inevitable. Once the first person speaks, the social enforcement that maintains silence loses credibility. Others may follow, either emboldened or forced to explain themselves. In the royal context, these pacts are not uncommon. Historians and biographers have documented countless instances where private agreements, sometimes informal, sometimes semi-official, shape the behavior of key figures. They are used to protect reputations, prevent scandal, and maintain the appearance of unity. But they are inherently fragile because they rely entirely on human discretion and ethical alignment. The alleged Meghan Markle, Prince Andrew pact, in this sense, fits into a long tradition of controlled narratives within royal circles. It was reportedly designed to prevent discussion of an encounter that, if publicized, could have had far-reaching implications for public perception. However, as the years passed, the very mechanisms that sustain the pact, the shared understanding of consequences, the social leverage, the implicit trust, began to show signs of decay. The intrigue deepens when you consider the roles of intermediaries. These are the people who monitor, reinforce, and sometimes enforce the rules of discretion. They ensure that participants remain compliant, mediate potential disputes, and occasionally negotiate minor allowances without compromising the core agreement. Sources indicate that intermediaries are often powerful figures themselves, with access to information that can make or break reputations. In the case of the alleged yacht pact, intermediaries would have been crucial in maintaining order, coordinating messaging, and ensuring no unintended disclosures occurred. Yet, intermediaries are also human. They make errors, misinterpret intentions, and sometimes choose sides. When one participant senses that the intermediaries are no longer impartial, the balance of power shifts. Allegedly, Ferguson perceived that these support structures had weakened. The protective influence that once ensured silence was no longer as reliable. This perception, more than anything, may have catalyzed her decision to step forward. Finally, consider the broader public context. Royal audiences have evolved dramatically in the past decade. Social media, investigative journalism, and an insatiable appetite for behind-the-scenes stories have created a climate where secrets are increasingly difficult to maintain. What once remained confined to palace walls now spreads at the speed of a tweet. The cultural and technological landscape means that silence, even when legally or socially enforced, is no longer absolute. Sarah Ferguson, with decades of experience navigating both public and private scrutiny, would have understood this better than anyone. Allegedly, her timing was not coincidental. It was calculated to intersect with heightened public interest, ensuring that her disclosure would be heard and that the context of the alleged pact would be appreciated. So, the royal culture of silence pacts is more than just a quirk of etiquette. It is a mechanism of control, a means of protection, and a delicate social contract. And like all social contracts, it is vulnerable to human unpredictability. What happens when one person steps outside the rules? When one participant decides the cost of silence outweighs the cost of exposure. That is the question Ferguson allegedly forced into the open. And when she did, she didn't just challenge a pact. She challenged the very culture that enabled it. But the consequences of breaking such a pact are never immediate or obvious. The first cracks are subtle: a glance misread, a meeting avoided, a comment that raises suspicion. And yet, these cracks grow, eventually threatening to expose everything that had been carefully managed. And so, as Ferguson allegedly positioned herself to speak, she entered a precarious space. She was no longer just a former royal with knowledge. She was a potential catalyst, the person who could destabilize a carefully maintained equilibrium. And that is where the chapter ends, on the brink of revelation, with the mechanisms of silence exposed, but the full storm yet to arrive. A year that seems ordinary at first glance. The world moved forward with elections, sporting events, celebrity news cycles. But behind the headlines, certain events allegedly unfolded in private, aboard luxury yachts, in the hushed corridors of elite social circles. It was a year that would later become a fulcrum in whispered conversations, a year no one talks about openly, yet one that everyone who mattered remembers vividly. Why does 2010 matter? Because this is when the alleged yacht encounter between Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew supposedly took place. A meeting that, decades later, fuels speculation, commentary, and the rumored silence pact. Not the kind of publicized royal event with cameras, press releases, and official statements. No, this was a private, high-stakes encounter that existed in a world insulated from ordinary scrutiny. The first question that arises when exploring 2010 is context. Meghan Markle at the time was not yet a global figure, not yet a duchess, and not yet a symbol subject to intense media attention. She was carving out her career, networking in circles where opportunity and risk intersected daily. Prince Andrew, on the other hand, was a seasoned royal navigating both public duties and private entanglements. Their alleged paths crossing in such a private, luxurious setting, an environment designed for discretion, was, in theory, precisely the kind of situation where silence agreements emerge. To understand why the year matters, consider the cultural and social landscape. 2010 was a period when traditional media still dominated, yet social media platforms were gaining influence. Private missteps were still somewhat containable, but leaks could spread fast if amplified by influential voices. In other words, secrecy was achievable, but fragile. The alleged yacht encounter itself is enveloped in mystery. According to sources in commentary circles, the meeting was not intended to make history. It was incidental, almost mundane in its timing. Yet the perceived implications of the meeting created a situation that insiders would later label sensitive. And in sensitive situations, insiders rely on unspoken agreements, the very kind of silence pacts Ferguson would later reference. The social dynamics of 2010 played a crucial role. Meghan, ambitious and strategic, was navigating an elite world far removed from ordinary experience. Her interactions were closely monitored by those around her, and her image was being carefully cultivated. Prince Andrew, a figure already scrutinized by the public and the press, operated under an entirely different set of pressures, expectations of duty, legacy, and family reputation. When these two paths converged, it allegedly created a scenario where discretion was essential. The alleged agreement that emerged from this encounter reportedly had multiple layers. Not simply a promise to avoid discussion, but an intricate understanding about what could be mentioned publicly, what could remain private, and how each participant would act to protect the other. These layers are typical of elite social pacts. The outermost layer is protection against public knowledge, the second layer shields reputations, and the innermost layer enforces loyalty through social consequences. What makes 2010 fascinating is not only the encounter itself, but the timing relative to global events. Social media influence was rising, and public fascination with royals was intensifying. Any private misstep carried the potential to cascade into scandal with unprecedented speed. In such an environment, the mechanisms of silence are not just practical, they are survival tools. Yet human behavior is rarely flawless. Even with an alleged agreement in place, cracks form over time. Participants forget, misinterpret, or reinterpret the terms. Memories shift, alliances change, and the trust that once held the pact together begins to erode. In this sense, 2010 was the starting point, but the real drama lies in how the alleged pact aged over time. Sources suggest that intermediaries, people whose job is to monitor and reinforce the rules of discretion, played a key role in ensuring compliance. These intermediaries were responsible for maintaining boundaries, interpreting subtle social cues, and intervening when breaches appeared imminent. Their presence gave the pact power, but also created vulnerabilities. Intermediaries are human, and their judgments are influenced by loyalty, fatigue, or external pressures. The slightest misstep can unravel the most carefully constructed agreements. The alleged significance of 2010 extends beyond the immediate encounter. It was a period of intersection, of career ambitions, family expectations, social visibility, and personal decisions. Small choices made in this environment, whom to trust, what to say, and when to speak, had long-reaching consequences. Allegedly, those who navigated this landscape effectively could protect themselves and others, while those who miscalculated risked exposure. Another layer to consider is the psychological impact of carrying secrets over time. Silence agreements, no matter how well constructed, exert an emotional toll. Participants must constantly monitor their own behavior, anticipate others' reactions, and suppress natural impulses to speak. In some cases, this results in stress, anxiety, and heightened sensitivity to perceived threats. Ferguson, having survived royal scrutiny herself, would understand this better than most. The burden of knowledge is not static. It accumulates, creating pressure that eventually demands release. Allegedly, as years passed, the yacht pact became increasingly precarious. Changing circumstances, public attention on Meghan Markle, renewed interest in Prince Andrew, and Ferguson's own reflections, altered the balance of power. What had once been a manageable, enforceable understanding became a source of tension. Who would honor the pact? Who might break it? And who, ultimately, would decide the timing of revelation? Publicly, 2010 may seem distant and insignificant, but in the shadows, it shaped behaviors, decisions, and alliances for the next decade. It created a web of interdependencies, with each participant subtly reinforcing the other's commitment to silence. This web is precisely what makes the alleged break so compelling. Once one person steps outside, the entire network begins to wobble. As we examine this year, the patterns become clear. Elite circles operate on trust, reinforced by fear of consequence and desire for advantage. Agreements like the alleged yacht pact are not arbitrary. They are rational strategies to manage risk and preserve image. But no system is infallible, especially when human ambition, curiosity, and shifting priorities come into play. Ferguson's alleged intervention is a turning point. By acknowledging knowledge of 2010 and the alleged pact, she disrupts the delicate balance maintained for years. She challenges not only the secrecy of that encounter, but also the broader culture of silence that shields the powerful. Her decision sets the stage for conflicts, revelations, and cascading consequences that were once merely hypothetical. The year 2010, therefore, is not just a date on a timeline. It is the origin of tension, the starting point for alliances and agreements, and the backdrop against which the story of secrecy, silence, and strategic revelation unfolds. Every whispered conversation, every carefully measured statement, and every strategic decision in the years following can be traced back, allegedly, to that pivotal year. And yet, despite its centrality, 2010 is almost always ignored in public discourse. That omission is deliberate. According to insiders, acknowledgement risks unraveling reputations, exposing complicity, and challenging narratives carefully maintained over time. But when Ferguson allegedly chose to speak, she forced the past into the present, demanding that history confront the choices made behind closed doors. And that is where this chapter ends, with the alleged encounter of 2010 no longer safely tucked away in memory, but emerging as the linchpin of a narrative about secrecy, loyalty, and the delicate, often dangerous balance of power. Before the headlines, before the royal title, before the global fascination, Meghan Markle was, by most accounts, just another ambitious young woman navigating the intricate labyrinth of elite social and professional circles. But as anyone observing her trajectory could see, she was not just ambitious. She was strategic, deliberate, and acutely aware of how perception shapes reality. To understand the alleged yacht encounter and the resulting silence pact, it's crucial to examine the woman at the center before she became a duchess. What did Meghan want? What were her priorities? And how did her early career and personal choices position her within a world where access equals opportunity? In 2010, Meghan was building her brand. She had a recognizable face from her work in television, but her reach was still limited compared to the global fame she would later achieve. Yet she understood the power of influence. Every meeting, every introduction, and every social setting was an opportunity to establish connections that could accelerate her ambitions. In elite circles, this is a survival skill. Timing, proximity, and relationship management can often matter more than formal credentials or achievements. Sources familiar with her early life and career suggest that Meghan had a keen sense of opportunity. She identified key individuals, influential networks, and strategic encounters that could shape her trajectory. It was not opportunism in the reckless sense. It was calculated. Every interaction had potential implications, and she reportedly navigated these with both caution and intention. The alleged encounter on the yacht in 2010 illustrates this approach. At the time, Meghan's social position was distinct from that of the established royals she would later interact with. She was an outsider, yet she moved within circles where wealth, power, and influence intersected. In this environment, understanding unspoken rules was essential. Knowing how to interact without overstepping, how to assert presence without creating friction, and how to leave a positive impression without attracting unwanted scrutiny were skills Meghan had honed long before her royal introduction. This alleged encounter, then, was not simply a meeting of two people, it was a collision of worlds. On one side, a young woman carefully crafting her future. On the other, a royal figure navigating the consequences of privilege, expectation, and legacy. The dynamic created a situation where discretion was essential and where agreements, spoken or unspoken, could have lasting implications. The idea of strategic silence is not unique to royalty. In professional and social elite circles, there is often an implicit understanding. Some interactions are remembered, some are reported, but many are kept private to protect reputations and facilitate ongoing relationships. Allegedly, Meghan understood this instinctively, and her behavior during and after the alleged encounter reflected an awareness of both opportunity and risk. It is also worth examining the psychological dimension. Ambition can coexist with caution, but navigating high-stakes environments requires emotional intelligence. Allegedly, Meghan displayed a keen ability to read people, understand motivations, and anticipate consequences. This combination of foresight and adaptability positioned her in ways that many observers note as extraordinary for someone her age and stage of career. Yet ambition comes with its own set of vulnerabilities. The very qualities that enable a person to seize opportunity can also attract scrutiny, speculation, and controversy. For Meghan, every choice had potential ramifications, not only for her personal trajectory, but for those around her. The alleged yacht encounter exemplifies this tension. It was a private moment, yet its implications, as some sources suggest, had public resonance that would later become impossible to ignore. It is here, in this period before fame and titles, that the context for the alleged silence pact emerges. Not because Meghan was inherently secretive, but because the environments she navigated demanded discretion. Alliances, reputations, and access all depended on the ability to manage information strategically. In many ways, the pact can be understood as a structural necessity, an agreement designed to protect all parties while preserving appearances. At the same time, ambition drives action. Meghan's trajectory demonstrates that individuals often calculate risk and reward in parallel. Sources suggest that she weighed the potential benefits of networking and engagement against the potential exposure of sensitive interactions. This balancing act, between visibility and protection, ambition and caution, is at the heart of elite social maneuvering. And then there is the matter of perception. Before becoming a public figure subject to global scrutiny, Meghan had a reputation to cultivate, impressions to manage, and social capital to accrue. Allegedly, her awareness of how encounters could be interpreted informed her actions during the yacht incident, her subsequent behavior, and her interactions with those who were part of the alleged agreement. In elite circles, perception is reality, and those who can master it often control outcomes in ways that outsiders rarely understand. It is also essential to recognize the duality of opportunity and risk in this period. Meghan's ambition positioned her for success, but every interaction carried potential fallout. The alleged encounter was a microcosm of this dynamic, a moment of opportunity coupled with the need for discretion, a chance to establish influence while navigating the invisible but potent rules of social compliance. Allegedly, this period laid the foundation for future leverage. Knowledge of interactions, understanding of agreements, and the ability to navigate them strategically would later serve as crucial tools in a world where public narratives, media scrutiny, and institutional dynamics intersected. The choices made in these early years had implications not only for personal trajectory, but also for relationships and reputations that would reverberate for over a decade. Ferguson's alleged revelation decades later, then, is framed not simply by the event itself, but by the context in which it occurred. The encounter was not random. It was embedded in a web of ambition, strategy, and social navigation. Understanding Meghan before the palace, her motives, awareness, and adaptability, is critical to understanding why a silence pact, whether formal or informal, was considered necessary, and why breaking it carries such dramatic consequences. Finally, consider the broader emotional undertone. Ambition is often accompanied by tension, uncertainty, and careful calculation. In high-stakes environments, the margin for error is minimal. Allegedly, Meghan's actions during this period reflect a deep understanding of this tension, an ability to anticipate consequences, and a willingness to navigate complex dynamics with both caution and strategy. These qualities, according to sources, not only shaped her personal trajectory, but also influenced the structure and enforcement of the alleged silence pact that would follow. And so, as we move forward in this story, it is clear that the alleged events of 2010, combined with Meghan's calculated approach to opportunity, created a perfect storm. A storm where discretion, power, and ambition intersected. A storm where the rules of silence were written in the shadows, and where Ferguson's eventual intervention would later challenge everything carefully maintained for years. Power, legacy, influence. These are words that define royalty in the modern age, yet they are lived every day in subtle interactions, strategic relationships, and carefully controlled appearances. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, embodies this dynamic. To understand the alleged silence pact, it is essential to examine his position, his network, and the influence he wielded in both private and public spheres during 2010 and beyond. Prince Andrew is no ordinary royal. Born into privilege, trained for military service, and accustomed to navigating both ceremonial duties and international diplomacy, he developed a unique understanding of influence. But influence is not just public recognition. It is also private power, the ability to affect outcomes behind the scenes, to guide narratives, and to leverage social structures to maintain control. In 2010, Andrew was navigating a complex landscape. The monarchy was under scrutiny in various arenas, and the media's appetite for controversy was insatiable. Every move was watched, every connection analyzed, and every interaction had potential consequences. In this environment, discretion was not a preference, it was a requirement. The alleged encounter with Meghan Markle sits at the intersection of Andrew's private influence and the need for controlled perception. While the specifics of the encounter remain shrouded in rumor, commentary circles suggest that Andrew's network, social leverage, and command of elite norms created a situation where silence was considered not just desirable, but necessary. Allegedly, the unspoken understanding between the parties was reinforced by his authority, the implicit social hierarchies, and the risks of exposure that any public misstep could create. Andrew's role in this alleged pact is multifaceted. On one level, he is a participant, someone whose reputation, access, and legacy are directly implicated. On another level, he functions as an enforcer. His position in the hierarchy allows him to shape the behavior of others, either through subtle persuasion, social expectation, or strategic encouragement. The alleged silence pact, therefore, is not just a bilateral agreement. It is embedded in a broader web of influence that Andrew both inhabits and manages. This web is composed of various elements: trusted intermediaries, social enforcers, and shared cultural understandings of propriety and discretion. These elements work together to maintain stability, prevent leaks, and ensure that sensitive matters remain confined to controlled channels. Allegedly, in the context of the 2010 encounter, Andrew's influence ensured that compliance with the pact was perceived as both necessary and non-negotiable. Yet power is rarely absolute. Influence is contingent upon perception, trust, and mutual dependence. Even the most powerful figures face vulnerabilities when circumstances shift. In the years following the alleged encounter, public attention, evolving relationships, and changing personal priorities created pressure on the pact. Observers suggest that Andrew's ability to enforce silence may have diminished over time, particularly as outside attention increasingly focused on Meghan Markle, her rising profile, and her eventual entry into the royal sphere. The psychology of influence also plays a critical role. Individuals like Andrew operate in environments where loyalty is currency, discretion is survival, and social expectations are rigidly enforced. Allegedly, these dynamics created both compliance and tension. Those involved in the yacht incident understood the stakes. Missteps could jeopardize social standing, public perception, and, in some cases, personal safety within the framework of reputation management. The alleged pact also reflects the intersection of personal and institutional considerations. Andrew's public duties and private relationships were intertwined, creating a scenario in which a single disclosure could have cascading effects. Allegedly, this is why a structured, albeit informal, agreement was necessary. Silence was not merely a preference. It was a mechanism to protect multiple layers of reputation and influence simultaneously. Sources familiar with royal insider commentary indicate that Andrew's network extended far beyond immediate family. Friends, advisors, and intermediaries played a role in reinforcing behavioral norms, monitoring interactions, and mitigating potential leaks. In effect, the pact operated as a microcosm of broader mechanisms of elite control, power exercised not through coercion alone, but through social expectation, alignment of interests, and mutual self-preservation. But influence, no matter how extensive, is always subject to human variability. Trust can erode, priorities can shift, and loyalty can falter. Allegedly, this is where the system begins to fail. While Andrew's network could initially enforce compliance, over time, external pressures, media scrutiny, public interest, and changes in personal relationships created conditions where the silence pact became vulnerable. Ferguson's alleged decision to speak decades later highlights these vulnerabilities. By stepping forward, she challenges the assumptions of control, tests the durability of influence, and exposes the delicate balance between private discretion and public scrutiny. The pact, once reinforced by Andrew's authority and network, suddenly becomes subject to negotiation, reinterpretation, and potential collapse. It is also important to recognize the symbolic dimension. Andrew's alleged participation in the yacht pact represents more than a single incident. It symbolizes the mechanisms by which elite figures maintain control over narrative and perception. Allegedly, the pact is emblematic of how power operates in private, through influence, hierarchy, and mutual understanding, rather than through explicit legal structures. Yet the most compelling aspect is the interplay between authority and vulnerability. Andrew's influence could enforce silence, but it could not erase memory, suppress curiosity, or prevent the gradual accumulation of pressure that eventually led Ferguson to intervene. Allegedly, the balance of power that once protected the pact shifted over time, creating an opening for disruption. This chapter, therefore, serves as a critical bridge between the private dynamics of 2010 and the public consequences of decades later. Understanding Andrew's network, authority, and the mechanisms he allegedly relied upon to maintain silence is essential to grasp why Ferguson's revelation had such dramatic potential. The pact was more than a simple agreement. It was a delicate ecosystem of influence, expectation, and calculated discretion. And yet, as with all fragile systems, the smallest perturbation can set off cascading effects. Allegedly, Ferguson's choice to speak did just that. It did not merely reveal information. It threatened to destabilize relationships, challenge authority, and bring long-hidden dynamics into the public eye. As this chapter closes, the stage is set for the unfolding consequences. The network of influence, the rules of discretion, and the stakes of exposure are all clear. But the human element remains unpredictable. When individuals act outside the expected parameters, the carefully maintained structures begin to wobble, and no one can predict how the resulting chain reaction will unfold. Luxury yachts are more than symbols of wealth. They are floating microcosms of power, influence, and discretion. In these spaces, privacy is carefully curated, and interactions that might seem casual to outsiders are often steeped in strategic calculation. The alleged 2010 encounter between Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew took place in such a world, a setting designed to ensure that what happened on board stayed on board. Imagine a vessel gliding over calm waters, far from prying eyes, hosting influential individuals whose reputations are meticulously managed. Every conversation, every gesture is observed, interpreted, and, in some cases, strategically manipulated. Allegedly, it was in this environment that a pivotal interaction occurred. An encounter that would later necessitate the whispered silence pact that Sarah Ferguson referenced decades later. The encounter, according to commentary circles, was not designed to make headlines. It was not an orchestrated event with cameras and reporters. It was a private, seemingly inconsequential meeting in a world where discretion was expected. Yet, as many insiders would later note, even moments that appear trivial in the moment can carry enormous weight when filtered through the lens of reputation management and elite social dynamics. The psychology of private encounters in elite spaces is fascinating. Every participant must navigate multiple layers of awareness simultaneously: personal impression, public perception, and the potential long-term consequences of every action. Allegedly, both Meghan and Andrew understood these dynamics instinctively. Their behaviors were influenced not just by immediate social cues, but by the implicit understanding that certain boundaries could not be crossed without risk. Allegedly, it was during this encounter that the seeds of the so-called Silence Pact were planted. The agreement was not formal, nor was it written. Its power came from mutual interest, social leverage, and the shared understanding that disclosure could have significant consequences. In elite environments, these unspoken agreements often carry more weight than contracts. They are enforced through expectation, reputation, and the subtle mechanisms of influence. Observers suggest that the yacht setting amplified the need for discretion. Being on a private vessel removed participants from conventional oversight, but it also concentrated the potential impact of any misstep. The isolated nature of the environment meant that behavior could be scrutinized more intensely by those present, and any perceived breach of protocol could reverberate far beyond the immediate context. For Meghan, this encounter was situated within a broader strategy of career and social positioning. Her awareness of opportunity and risk would allegedly guide her actions, ensuring that interactions reinforced her trajectory while minimizing exposure. For Andrew, the encounter required balancing private conduct with the maintenance of public reputation. In this delicate interplay, the principles of silence and discretion became paramount. The alleged pact that emerged is a textbook example of elite agreement dynamics. First, it served as protection, ensuring that neither party's reputation would be compromised. Second, it established boundaries, defining what could be mentioned and what had to remain unspoken. Third, it leveraged mutual dependence. Each participant had a vested interest in maintaining silence, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of compliance. But even the most meticulously structured agreements are subject to human variability. Memory fades, priorities shift, and subtle misalignments in understanding can accumulate over time. Allegedly, this is where the seeds of eventual disruption were sown. While the pact initially provided a framework for stability, decades later, the pressures of public curiosity, personal reflection, and shifting relationships would challenge its durability. The ambience of the yacht itself contributed to the gravity of the moment. Luxury yachts are designed for comfort, but they are also theaters of social performance. Every action can be magnified, every interaction interpreted in multiple ways. Allegedly, those present were aware of the stakes, understanding that even seemingly minor gestures or comments could be scrutinized later, either by insiders or by the public if the information leaked. It is also important to consider the psychological impact of such settings. Isolation can heighten self-awareness and intensify social dynamics. Participants may feel both liberated and constrained simultaneously, freedom from external observation, but heightened pressure from those present. Allegedly, this tension shaped the encounter between Meghan and Andrew, influencing behavior, perception, and ultimately the perceived need for a formal understanding of silence. The alleged yacht encounter also highlights the interplay between agency and power. Each participant brought their own set of expectations, goals, and social acumen. Meghan, navigating a world she was still integrating into, allegedly exercised careful judgment to protect her trajectory. Andrew, as an established figure, had to balance authority with discretion, understanding that his actions carried broader implications. The resulting alignment, or tension, set the stage for the pact that would later be referenced by Ferguson. Intermediaries, as in other elite agreements, played a critical role. These individuals, often advisors or close confidants, monitor behavior, manage communication, and ensure compliance. Allegedly, their presence reinforced the silent understanding, creating layers of oversight that made deviation less likely. Yet, human intermediaries are fallible, and over time, the structures they maintain can erode, particularly as external pressures mount. The alleged pact was thus both a product of the encounter and a reflection of broader social dynamics: ambition, reputation, trust, and the strategic management of perception. It was designed to endure, but its endurance relied on ongoing alignment of interests, careful behavior, and the implicit enforcement of social norms. However, as the years passed, the environment around the pact changed. Meghan's profile grew, public curiosity intensified, and the relevance of the alleged encounter became harder to contain. What was once a private agreement in a controlled environment became a topic of speculation, rumor, and eventual scrutiny. The fragile equilibrium maintained by influence, trust, and discretion began to strain. This is where Ferguson's alleged intervention enters the narrative. By choosing to speak decades later, she disrupts a system that had been carefully maintained, challenging assumptions of compliance and testing the limits of discretion. Her decision does not merely reveal information. It threatens to unravel a network of agreements, relationships, and reputational safeguards established over years. The yacht encounter, therefore, is not just a historical footnote. It is the linchpin of a complex narrative about power, discretion, and influence. It illustrates how elite environments operate, how agreements are enforced, and how fragile even the most carefully structured pacts can become over time. And as the chapter closes, the stakes are clear. The alleged secrets of that yacht are no longer safely contained. What happened in private decades ago now has the potential to reshape public perception, test loyalty, and expose the delicate interplay of ambition, influence, and secrecy. Imagine holding a secret for years, decades even. A secret that, if revealed, could shake reputations, challenge alliances, and rewrite public perception. For Sarah Ferguson, allegedly, this was more than hypothetical, it was reality. The alleged 2010 yacht encounter between Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew had been hidden in plain sight, preserved by mutual discretion, social expectation, and the invisible mechanisms of power. But at some point, Ferguson decided that silence was no longer an option. What drives someone to break such a pact? Loyalty, morality, frustration, or timing? Allegedly, for Ferguson, the decision was calculated, informed by experience, awareness of shifting dynamics, and a recognition of opportunity. After years of navigating royal scrutiny herself, she understood both the risks and rewards of revealing sensitive information. The act of speaking was not impulsive. It was strategic, deliberate, and potentially transformative. The moment of revelation, according to sources, was dramatic. Ferguson allegedly began with measured acknowledgement of her knowledge, carefully setting the stage. She framed her statements not as gossip or sensationalism, but as an effort to clarify historical events, provide context, and correct misconceptions. This approach is significant. It demonstrates a keen understanding of audience perception, the weight of authority, and the power of narrative control. Breaking a pact is never merely about disclosing facts. It's about framing them. Ferguson, aware of this, allegedly crafted her narrative to maximize credibility while minimizing personal risk. She relied on her insider status, her past experiences, and her understanding of both Meghan's trajectory and Andrew's influence. Every word, every inflection, was reportedly chosen to ensure impact without unnecessary provocation. The initial shockwaves were immediate. Media outlets, commentators, and public audiences reacted with a mixture of fascination, disbelief, and intrigue. A decades-old private agreement, allegedly now in the public domain, reshaped discussions about both Meghan and Andrew. It was not just a revelation. It was a recontextualization of history. What had once been a quiet footnote became headline news, analyzed, debated, and scrutinized from multiple angles. Allegedly, Ferguson's disclosure did more than illuminate the past. It exposed the fragility of elite mechanisms of control. The alleged yacht pact had functioned for years, maintained by mutual understanding and social leverage. But with Ferguson's words, the equilibrium shifted. Parties who had once complied were now faced with a choice: reaffirm discretion or respond to the new reality of public attention. Consider the psychological dimension. The act of speaking not only affects those who hear it, but also those who were involved in maintaining the secret. Allegedly, Andrew, Meghan, and other insiders experienced a mixture of surprise, concern, and strategic recalibration. For decades, they had relied on the durability of silence. Suddenly, that foundation was undermined. Every previous calculation had to be reassessed, every previous assumption reconsidered. The timing of Ferguson's intervention is also critical. It occurred at a moment when public fascination with Meghan Markle was high. Interest in royal scandals had reached a fever pitch, and media platforms amplified even subtle disclosures. In other words, the environment maximized the impact of the revelation, ensuring it would resonate far beyond immediate circles. Timing, in this context, was almost as important as content. Sources allege that Ferguson also framed her disclosure strategically in terms of accountability and transparency. She reportedly emphasized the human dimensions of the story, the pressures, expectations, and psychological realities that shaped behavior during the alleged 2010 encounter. By humanizing the participants, she invited public empathy while simultaneously highlighting the stakes of secrecy and discretion. The implications of speaking are manifold. On one level, Ferguson disrupted the specific pact allegedly held between Meghan and Andrew. On another, she challenged the broader culture of silence that governs elite interactions, reminding audiences that even powerful figures are subject to human unpredictability and ethical dilemmas. Her intervention serves as a case study in how insider knowledge, timing, and narrative control intersect to create public impact. Allegedly, the ripple effects were immediate. Social media discussions exploded with speculation, historical commentators revisited public appearances, and royal observers analyzed past behaviors for new meaning. Ferguson's disclosure